only take place if our business community and elected officials are willing to come together, which obviously we are, face to face, and have that honest conversation. So I am pleased and encouraged that both sides are very well represented this morning, right in this very room. We've elected officials from all levels of government and businesses here of all sizes. And when I say businesses, really we're looking at employers. We have a room full of nonprofits, we have a room full of business owners, small, large, 2 employees all the way up to thousands of employees. So it is, and we have really worked hard to make sure that your table is well represented in a diverse industry representation, size, and specifically though we have tried to hone in on putting elected officials with constituents that you can connect with on your local level. But everything that you're going to hear today from both the elected officials and the business community is going to be valuable for all of us. We believe that the business community is central for our community to flourish. When our businesses thrive, we strongly believe that our community thrives. Now, I would like to recognize the elected officials that are here in this room today who made it to today's event. And the whole idea of a democracy is that we're representing the voice of our people, and that's why we believe here that we want to connect that voice and have that voice to be heard from a business standpoint. So once I say your name, if you're here, there's been a couple of changes, so forgive me if I announce somebody here who isn't here, but if you are here, please stand so that we will hold applause, but I want everyone to be recognized who's taken time out of their day. Village of Windsor Deputy Mayor Tom Skinner. Town of Windsor Supervisor Carolyn Price. Town of Union Councilman Robert Mack. Binghamton Councilwoman Sophia Rosnetti. Binghamton Councilman Giovanni Scaringi. Binghamton Councilman Chris Papastrak. Vestal Councilwoman Sue Messina. Vestal Supervisor John Schaefer. Johnson City Trustee Clark Giblin. Johnson City Trustee Rick Bowes. Binghamton City Council Danny Kranz. Town of Dickinson, he wasn't able to make it today. Broome County Clerk Joe Mahalko. Chairman of the Broome County Legislature Dan J. Reynolds. Binghamton Mayor Richard David. He timed his entrance it could be more perfect. I believe he gets a round of applause for that. New York State Senator Fred Akshar. County Executive Jason Garner. New York State Assemblyman Clifford Crouch. New York State Assemblywoman Donna Lopardo. And Congresswoman Claudia Tenney. Let's give everybody a round of applause. Again, thank you. I feel like we have accomplished such a feat of strength, or it was actually a miracle, to get everybody in this room and to make happen what's going to happen today. I would like to thank the person and the business that this would not be possible for doing this, and that's our title sponsor, Tioga State Bank. It is important for us to help keep the cost down and support what the Chamber does, and our sponsorships do that. And this is a perfect event for them to sponsor because of the investment that they make in our community on a daily basis. So it is my pleasure to introduce Bob Fisher, the President and CEO of Tioga State Bank. Bob?
Well, thank you all for coming this morning. I'm not going to talk very long because I know you didn't come here to hear me talk. You came to hear EJ and talk about some other things. We're really proud as a bank to sponsor events such as this, where we have an opportunity to bring together our elected officials and business owners in our community. Tioga State Bank is the only independent community bank headquartered in Tioga County, New York. I know we're in Broome County, but it's right next door. As a small business located in the southern tier, I support and advocate for small businesses. Small businesses are truly responsible for the success of our economy. Small businesses create 64% of all new jobs in New York and the U.S. Small businesses reinvest in the local economy. And small businesses give back to the communities they serve in donations, contributions, and leaderships to local charities and organizations. So please support all of our local small businesses and even our larger businesses. So it's really important. So now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, E.J. McMahon. E.J. is founder and research director of the Empire Center for Public Policy. McMahon's writings and research focuses on improving New York's economic competitiveness and promoting greater transparency, accountability, and fiscal responsibility in state and local government. He has authored and co-authored major studies on public pension reform, collective bargaining, population migration, budget trends, and tax policy in New York. His influential Blueprint for a Better Budget, published in January 2010, featured a number of recommendations subsequently implemented under Governors David Paterson and Andrew Cuomo. McMahon has published numerous articles and essays and publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Barron's, the Public Interest, the New York Post, the New York Daily News, Newsday, and the Manhattan Institute's City Print, radio, and TV interviews have included appearances on CNBC, Fox News Channel, and Bloomberg News, as well as on regional cable and broadcast outlets throughout New York State. McMahon's professional background includes nearly 30 years as an Albany-based analyst and a close observer of the New York State government. And without further ado, I present E.J. McMahon.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bob, and good morning to everybody in the room. This is really an impressive gathering, and I'm honored to be here with all of you and also with all of your elected officials, seemingly everybody from the federal level on down. And it's very impressive, and it's a sign of a commitment to the region. Certainly inspiring as we go on. When Jennifer and her team asked me to talk this morning, they specifically asked me to talk about the business climate. That was a phrase they used, and I'm glad they used that phrase, and it inspired the title you see of my talk here, because the business climate is really what you need to focus on. It's a good metaphor because just as in the general sense, climate is something that takes in not just the temperature, but the moisture, precipitation, barometric pressure, sunlight, soil conditions. That's kind of describes, that's an analogy to the issues that we need to discuss here, because the business climate is a factor of all those things that go into creating the environment in which businesses operate and seek to grow and employ people and make money. And so the business climate factors that are analogous to the weather factors are taxes, regulations, and essential public services. And by essential public services, I mean infrastructure, public safety, and education. Those are the core issues of climate. And what we're going to talk about today are where we have gone off, where we can control some of those factors, and what can be done to control them and reshape them for the benefit of the economy's ability to grow in the future. What issues you can't control that you need to keep an eye on. I'd also like right up front to differentiate climate from a phrase that people in government also often use, especially in state government. That phrase is economic development. Economic development does not equate to the business climate. Economic development can benefit from a favorable business climate, but economic development cannot reshape a business climate. In fact, economic development, when, as too often happens, when it's an excuse for avoiding tough decisions that affect the business climate, can actually make the climate worse. So the economic development, as we understand it, which is essentially boils down to deal making and subsidization, economic development doesn't make the climate. It can be affected by the climate, but it doesn't shape the climate any more than a single building makes its own weather. And Binghamton, the Binghamton metro area, like all the metro areas in upstate New York, even the largest, Buffalo, are small by national standards, don't have the critical mass to have the kind of development and growth artificially created that can actually change the weather on their own. You We need to fix the climate. So that's an important issue going forward. And as I get into this now, I think it's important to face certain facts about what economic conditions are in the state as a whole and in different regions of the state. So we know the challenge that we face moving ahead. Let's start at the state level with the core measure that we often use in measuring the progress of the state's economy. Starting with the base year of 2010, not just because that's marks right before the beginning of the current governor's tenure, but because that was just past the end of the Great Recession. The red line here traces private sector payroll growth in New York State. And as you can see, that's a healthy upward slope. The state has gained about 1 million jobs since 2010. And if you line that up against the federal trend, they're almost directly the same. The state has gained jobs as a whole. The state as a whole has gained jobs at the same pace as the U.S. as a whole since 2010. The state actually had a less severe recession as a whole because it didn't have as big a boom. And because because the whole focus of federal policy in the late Bush, early Obama era was to bail out Wall Street, which of course is located in our state. You'll note we fell off the national pace a bit in the last year and a half or so. The question is what that is continued off and on in the recent measures, but we have a better look back at the end of each year. Okay, the biggest story though of recent years, and I've been following economic and political issues in New York for quite a very long time now, and I'm a student of New York's history, and I'm sure many of you are. There never has been as great a disparity between upstate and downstate as there has been in the last 15 to 20 years, especially in the last 10 years. Upstate has fallen further and further behind. Now this is partly a macro story. The internal regions of the country have been falling up behind relative to global coastal cities that are centers of wealth. The New Yorks, the Bostons, the Washingtons, the San Franciscos, the LAs are the places that are becoming wealthy as fast as smaller metro regions in the interior of the country. It's a story that's also going on in the Midwest, are falling behind by comparison. But upstate used to be one of the most prosperous interior regions of the country. Upstate was dynamic, upstate was enterprising. Many of the upstate regions, not all of them, had higher per capita incomes than the national average. That's not true in any of them now. Upstate New York is falling behind. So 89% of the job growth that we've seen in the state since 2010, 89% has been downstate. Downstate defined as the metropolitan commuter district, the Hudson Valley, New York City, Long Island, 89%. Let's go back a little longer now. This is another line of employment. It goes all the way back to 2000. 2000 was the peak of an economic cycle right before it dipped. And that was brought on largely by the popping of the tech bubble more than 9/11. So there's the line of state employment. That's the trend. That's a trend line. Okay, it's logarithmic, measured from 100. Okay, that's the state. Here's upstate. So no, the state as a whole has gained basically net employment, private sector employment for the state as a whole is up about 12% since the year 2000. If you pull upstate out, as of 2017, upstate's private sector employment level was about equal to where it was in 2000 after having staggered and fallen twice in the meantime. It's kind of basically made it back. Now, here's Binghamton. Binghamton metro area has 14% fewer jobs than it did in 2000. Whatever word you use to describe this, the word is not soaring. And that's not true recently, and it hasn't been true for a while. This is the challenge. There is no metropolitan area of this size in New York. There are smaller rural areas. There's the North Country, which has been kind of moving sideways for decades. But there's no metropolitan area this size in New York that has been declining in this way for this long. So the main challenge, the main problem is a lack of growth. That's the challenge facing this area. Now, when people seek to look on the bright side, and there are many bright sides, I'm not going to get into the caveats. You will know what the positives and strengths are of your particular community and of this region. But when people try to look at the statistical bright side, what do you often hear about? You hear about the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate has dropped. As you can see here, the unemployment rate was up to almost 9% at its peak in the trailing end of the Great Recession, and now it's down to below 5%. So that's something, right? Well, it would be if it actually reflected an increase in employment. Resident employment has actually decreased during the period in which the unemployment rate has decreased. The reason the unemployment rate has gone down is because the unemployment rate is the result of a fraction, and the denominator has gone down faster. The workforce in this region has been shrinking faster than employment opportunities. This makes sense. People don't hang around waiting for and looking for work in a place that's not creating jobs. And in fact, there's a related factor, as you know, which is population. 42 of the 50 counties in upstate New York have lost population since the last census. You can see by the shading here, you can see where Broome and Tioga are. I don't have to point out to you. They're among the bigger losers among upstate counties in terms of total population. This is something that it's not confined to this region, but it is a factor. And one of the reasons for the population decline is an outflow of people to other parts of the country. This map shows the net outflow as a percentage of the 2010 population from each county of New York State. Note, see the two lightly shaded counties? There's only 2 counties in the entire state of New York that gained more people than they lost from the rest of the country, including the rest of the state. Those counties are Saratoga County and Ontario County. Saratoga County and Ontario County are both lovely greenfield counties without large cities, with bustling, booming tourism industries and lots of pleasant subdivisions, and they feed off their urban areas they're near, and they have low taxes by New York standards. They've both been booming for decades. In percentage terms, the biggest population losses in New York State to this factor are in New York City. There's a churn through New York City. New York City loses a bigger percentage of its population to migration than even most of upstate does. But it replenishes because it has a higher birth rate and high foreign immigration. And that's the whole reason the net state population is going up. So these are factors. When you don't have people, then that's another reason your economy is not expanding. It's a chicken and the egg problem, obviously. Which comes first? You've got to keep people here looking for jobs, but you've got to create jobs for them. You've got to create economic opportunity, which is where we get the climate. One other chart I want to show, however, which is indicative of the challenge that you as members of a chamber face and that you as elected officials face. If you want to have growth, you need to have a constituency that sees the need for growth and actually favors growth. Do most voters want growth? Here's one measure of that reflects that issue. And if I'd gone back further, you would have seen a different number. This is from the year 2001, which is the earliest in the current ABA data series on personal income. What percentage of personal income in each county, in Broome and Tioga, do people earn in the form of transfer payments, which is mainly Social Security and disability payments and welfare of different sorts? It's money you get for something other than working. That's a transfer payment. What percentage of the income in this county comes from transfer payments plus government salaries? That is, you're on a government payroll. Now, by the way, if I went back 30 years, this all-state number you'll see there is 28%. If you go back 30 years to the mid-80s, it was 28% then. Broome was also 28% then. It was the statewide average. Tioga was much lower than the statewide average, but I started in 2001. Okay, you see the number there? Note, Broome County by 2000, the decline had started. 38% of the personal income in Broome County was transfer payments and government employment. Where was it the most recent year? Well, the state has gone up to 30%. By the way, the state number wobbles over the decades between 28 and 30%. Note, though, the change in Broome County. 44% of the personal income collected by residents of Broome County comes from transfer payments and from government employment. This reflects the constituency for growth. This is a constituency that's less interested in growth. It has less of a stake in growth. It has an indirect stake in growth, at best. Tioga has always been lower, but has now gotten higher, or is getting higher. That's an exception. Tioga was always low because of the large manufacturing operations there, particularly Lockheed Martin. Tioga had high income per capita by regional standards and had low dependence on government transfer payments. It's now flipped. So these are other indications of the challenge. Okay, that's it with the negativity. Okay, you don't need to hear more of this. The point is face facts. Let's face facts. All right, the fact is this region is starved for growth. What you need in your climate is a climate for growth. You're not looking this is not about foundation plannings and color, to use a gardening comparison. You need growth. And so the question is, as part of it as you approach this though, is as a group, as elected officials and as a group of business leaders, what can you do? That's the whole point of your confab this morning. It reminds me of, I came in here thinking of you're maybe familiar with the words of the Serenity Prayer. Give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'm going to try to focus today. We could spend all day on what the things are that need to change, plus notice some positives also, but let's look at some state level issues and also as they affect local issues that can be changed, and then we'll wrap up talking more about how they fit into what can change. The things you can change at the state and local level. And at the local level, there's a degree of dependency on state change. You can talk about taxes, the cost of government, labor regulations, energy policy, and development policy, in which I include planning and zoning and restrictions on development. So, let's look at where we stand. Here's a measure you often see. Let's go back now and look at the state. Because part of your problem, although you're doing worse than the rest of the state, is that you're in New York. That is a problem. That's a strength as well as a problem. By the way, let me quickly telegraph to you what the strength is. I don't think there's anybody in this room who still is under the delusion that we're paying a lot of taxes and it's all going to New York City. If you think that, you need to turn that on its head. You are very, very heavily subsidized from a flow of wealth from an increasingly wealthy downstate to here. So your benefit is you're feeding off of downstate, whether you know it or not. The disadvantage, it's not just the wealth that flows to school aid. You know about the well-heeled retirees who are part of the rural gentrification trend that occurs in some communities here, et cetera. There's even some investment opportunities created by that. That's the benefit. The disadvantage is policy. You're in New York State. Okay, this is from the Business Tax Climate Index of the Tax Foundation, which ranks us 49th. However, note, there's factors that go into that. So what are the factors that give us the second worst ranking in this Tax Foundation's Business Tax Climate Index? Well, one is the income tax. We have, depending on how you measure it, if you include this New York City income tax on top of the state income tax, it's the second highest tax rate on high incomes in the country. If you look at just the state rate separating out New York City, it's the seventh highest. Actually, it's the eighth highest now because New Jersey bumped its rate up and adopted its own so-called millionaire tax at a higher rate. But we have a pretty high income tax on high earners. We have a moderately high income taxes on everybody else, and very, very low and non-existent income taxes on the poor and lower middle income people. Our tax policies are very favorable to the working poor and to lower middle class workers, but start getting heavy the further up the scale you make. And basically, the message sent by our tax policy to wealth is go away. Now, we retain and have a lot of wealth because if taxes alone were the factor in where people located, there'd be nobody here, certainly in New York City. There's obviously a lot of other features that come into play. But at this point, there are a growing number of people in Albany who assume that you can tax with impunity, that you can just keep adding and adding and extending and extending. The problem is you're basically penalizing wealth. What the state and local tax deduction cap has done on the federal level has been to significantly increase at the top end of the income scale the net cost of living in New York. Now, it's easy for people in Washington, with all due respect to Congressman Matani, to say, well, that's your fault. Be more like us, says the guy like Texas. Well, we're not Texas. We're not going to slash teacher salaries 30%. We're not going to change staffing levels in nursing homes. We're not going to become Texas because we're not Texas. It doesn't mean we're not going to reduce costs, but that's not going to happen. You have a state with very high fixed government costs that has become increasingly reliant, including in the last 7 years, on very high income earners who just got hit with a tax increase. That's a problem, and that's the problem with high marginal rates. And that's going to remain a heavily debated issue in New York. That has to change. The millionaire tax, so-called, that adds to the top, expires at the end of 2019. It's been extended 3 times since it was created. If it never goes away, it's never going to cease being a problem, and it's going to be a bigger problem. I could talk about that all day because I've done a lot of work on that, but trust me, it's a problem. Here's an area that isn't a problem. Corporate tax rates, we have long had a pretty decent state corporate tax rate climate, which has just gotten better. We have completely eliminated the state corporate tax on incorporated manufacturers north of the Metropolitan Commuter District, which already had a favorable rate. Again, north of that area, which has a surcharge, our rate was above median. It's now in the median. And as a fact, in terms of the tax foundation rating, our overall corporate tax structure and rate is rated 7th. That means 7th best. So this is not a problem. Unfortunately, by the way, looking ahead, there will be people in Albany, there will be forces at work in Albany, not the governor, but other people, no matter who the governor is, but there will be forces at work legislatively, particularly from downstate, who see a relatively low competitive corporate tax rate as an opportunity, the opportunity being to raise it. So keep that in mind. Okay, sales taxes, I hope I don't need to tell you, we have one of the highest combined sales taxes in the country. We have this unique split, a unique degree of 50-50 or 50 plus to 48 split in state and local. We have the 9th highest average sales tax rate in the country. It's more like the 4th or 5th highest among states that have an income tax, because some states with higher sales taxes have no income tax and thus rely on their sales tax. We're like California. We have a very high sales tax, the highest in the Northeast. We have the lowest corporate tax in the Northeast and the highest average sales tax in the Northeast. Now, it's one thing to have a high consumption tax and have no income tax, but to have a fairly high income tax and a high consumption tax, that's a problem. So that's problematic. Last but not least, in terms of wealth, because wealth effects are a real thing. Everybody here is in business, you understand that. We are one of only 14 states that still have an estate or inheritance tax. This is not a case like, say, the income tax of, well, you know, if you go to Florida, there's no tax. Or it's not one of these taxes where a tiny handful of aggressively low-cost states don't have the tax and everybody else does. No. The vast majority of the states, over 70% of the states, have no estate tax and no inheritance tax. We don't have an inheritance tax. It could be worse. Pennsylvania is bad. It's one of those areas where Pennsylvania is worse than us. Connecticut's worse. Jersey is worse. But we have an estate tax still. A step was taken to make the estate tax less oppressive a few years ago. There was an important reform enacted by the legislature. It had a loose end. It's technically flawed. The feds have just moved the goalposts and raised the exemption level for the estate tax. They've just doubled it. Well, our exemption level was just refixed at the old level of the federal estate tax. We're not competitive in this area, and this message certainly to high net worth people is get your estate out of New York. Why would you want to compel wealth to leave New York State? Why would you want to do that? It's not about greedy, wealthy, awful people in the way that is often articulated. It's about wealth. It's about money in general. You are telling it to go. That's a problem. We need to be dedicated to phasing this out. We still collect over $1 billion a year from estate tax. Why? Because so many wealthy people who have left the state have property in New York from which their estates benefit. And we tax your property with our estate tax, even if you're not died, you're not here. But we shouldn't be deluded into thinking that it's okay. So that's an issue in that regard. Here's an area where there's been progress. One of several areas where there's been progress I'm going to mention. We have very high property taxes. Jersey often claims it's got the highest property tax in the country. It doesn't. It's close. The reason why we as a statewide, as a state, seem to rank low by some measures, because New York City is a mix. New York City has extraordinarily high, the highest rates in the country on commercial property and on multifamily property, but has some of the very lowest rates on single-family homes. Single-family homes in New York State, in New York City, detached single-family homes pay the lowest taxes east of the Mississippi. That's because the city has a pretty high income tax and high other taxes. They've chosen to lay off basically Staten Island and Queens. But if you take New York City out of the equation, there's absolutely no question that relative to income or relative to property value, New York has the highest property tax in the country. And some of the highest property taxes in the entire state of New York relative to property value are right here in Binghamton and in Broome County. The highest relative to property value, with few exceptions in New York State. The property tax cap enacted under Governor Cuomo in 2011 has been enormously valuable and effective in changing the psychology of budgeting, especially school budgeting around the state. Big caveat, it was not accompanied by the mandate relief and mandate reforms that local government should lead to more effectively and flexibly deal with the cap. But let me remind you, the cap is not actually a hard cap. It is basically a hurdle more than a cap. You have to overcome that hurdle. Local governments need a supermajority of their legislative bodies to get past it. A supermajority in a referendum is needed to overcome the school cap. It has held down the growth in taxes. And short of slashing local property taxes, if you can begin over a long period of time to hold that growth below the rate of inflation, after a period of time, you have much lower taxes than you would have had. It's the power of compounding in reverse. New Yorkers are saving billions of dollars because of that cap. That cap is up for renewal again next year. It needs to be made permanent. We could quibble about discussions about mandate relief are distractions and even dangerous distractions if they distract legislators from extending the cap permanently. It's extremely important. It's been very effective. So that's been a big factor, again, especially on schools. I'm going to make a point about property tax. You've heard about Medicaid takeover and the argument that we need to take over the county share of Medicaid. We're one of the few states that have counties pay a large share. Now, the county share, the growth in the county share was capped at 3% under Governor Pataki and has been frozen absolutely for the past 3 or 4 years under Governor Cuomo. Those were positive steps. A complete state takeover of the local county share of Medicaid, that would be a good thing. We just did a big report on this. Our health policy director, Bill Hammond, did it. It would also be extremely costly and complicated and is feasible only over a period of years. Let's say if you did it here in Broome County. In Broome County, if the state completely took over the local share of Medicaid, what would be the impact on the all-in property tax bill, like one of the highest tax places in New York State? What would be the impact? Answer, if applied totally to property taxes, it would reduce property taxes by about 10%. 10%, that's pretty good, right? Is that transformatively game-changing? No. It's a thing, be a good thing. The question is, can you get the whole state to distort and contort its finances sufficiently to take over every county's Medicaid expenditure? I suggest to you it's not going to happen anytime soon. Most of your property tax burden is municipal expenses when you're in a city and school spending. Why do we spend so much compared to other places? The answer, I've done a lot of work on this, I'm not going to bore you with the details, and the answer is because we do. No, it's not because we don't have countywide school districts. Yes, I know they have countywide school. It's not the number of school districts. It's not the number of municipalities. We employ more people and pay them more. It's that simple. We subject our capital costs to oppressive and expensive prevailing wage mandates and contracting requirements. We manage to find a way to do everything more expensive. That's why. There is no magic bullet. There are things that have to be done, which I'm going to get to. So, the tax priorities I've listed here. By the way, a condensed version of this I'm giving to the chamber to post for you to download, okay? You see things in here that interest you want to look at, you'll be able to get a PDF without the built-up slides, and you can kind of check those out, and you can look at our website, you can call us or email So there's a list of tax priorities. You got to fix the estate tax. You've got to eliminate the rate cliff in that tax. You've got to make the property tax cap permanent. You've got to start phasing out, if not immediately eliminating the millionaire tax, because we're just dangerously dependent on it. By the way, high-income people have very volatile incomes. The more dependent you are on billionaires and millionaires, the bigger the crash you're going to experience the next time there's a downturn in the market. Because everybody else's income will stay the same and theirs will drop by 40, 50, 60%. And after that drop, they'll still be rich, but the state treasury will be suffering a tremendous headache. Because that's what happens when you rely on high-income people. We got to control the cost of government. There are aspects of our law, I start with the Triborough Amendment, that state that even when a contract has expired, if you have steps in a contract, it's particularly true of schools, it's also true of police and fire to a lesser extent, that people continue receiving pay increases even when a contract has expired. How many people live in a town or school district where at some point in your life you've seen a lawn sign that says, you know, East Spencertown teachers, 280 days without a contract? Have you ever seen that sign? What they don't tell you is they may be without a contract, but they're still getting raises. Because there's no incentive to settle the contract when all of the step increases are still flowing out. That's the Triborough Amendment. That's another issue we've written extensively about. It needs to be repealed. It's almost unique in the country, by the way. This just illustrates how you could have a frozen contract and see pay go up. If you're just a Long Island teacher, as an example, these steps are 2 to 3 to 4% apart, meaning that's in addition to the base pay increase. So that's something that needs to change. Other issues, I won't get into all the details now because we don't have that much time. We have compulsory binding arbitration of all police and fire contracts in New York State. This has created a dynamic that has basically pumped up the cost and the inefficiency of many police departments and fire departments. It makes it hard to actually fundamentally restructure those deals. And I know the mayors in the room, anybody in the room who is a mayor or has been a mayor knows exactly what I'm talking about. Your hands and your feet are cuffed behind your back somehow. Weird. If you're trying, if you come into office and say, wait a minute, why do we do this thing? Why do we have duty shifts this way? Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Well, yeah, talk to us at contract time. And then when you do, they say, arbitration. This is a real problem. This is also a temporary law. The governor tried to cap arbitration costs in one of his first budgets. The legislative answer from both parties in both houses was no. And he, rather than make an issue of it, backed off, retreated, and settled for a phony reform that doesn't really change things much. This also needs to change. Now, let's look at pension costs. Pension costs spiked a few years ago. That's what this chart shows. It actually ends in 2016 and went down a little further in 2017. The problem is that pension costs have spiked at a much higher level than they used to be at. The fundamental problem of the pension system is that despite these reforms, it's still very expensive. It's still dependent on an accounting system that is fundamentally flawed, and every private sector actuary and financial economist agrees on this. They don't discount their liabilities by a large enough rate. If they work by corporate rules, they would be much more expensive. We are one market downturn away from these rates spiking again in the next few years. It remains a permanent threat to our fiscal health. What drives pension costs? Well, not just the benefits, the levels of salaries. A reform system is necessary again. The main thing we need to do is don't add to this. Every year the legislature is confronted with 50, 60 different bills sweeping pensions. Unions are at work doing what they do, not because they're bad people, by the way. A public employee union exists to protect absolutely everything its members have and to push for more. That's their reason for existing. They shouldn't be expected to act in any other way. Well, that's what they do. And what they're pushing for now is to whittle away at and essentially cancel out the relatively modest reforms that were enacted in Governor Cuomo's first term and get back to where they were, which will make the bomb a bigger explosion the next time there's a market downturn. So that's another problem that needs to be fought against and resisted, and where more reform is necessary. This talks about how pension costs went up statewide over nearly $5 billion, and you had your own impact on it here. It crowded out other public services at a time when your population was shrinking and your tax base was stagnating. The worst possible time is when that happened. I don't need to tell you the story if you followed it at all. There are other labor and public works rates. There's the prevailing wage, as I said. There's the so-called scaffold law. There's the minimum wage. Now, this is the map of minimum wages in the United States as of this year. The green states are the states with the highest minimum wage. We have a differential in New York, but the upstate minimum, which is now $10.40, is the 6th highest in the United States. When I was researching this issue and writing about it, when Governor Cuomo first proposed a statewide rate of 15 several years ago, the median wage in this region was below $10. The median wage. The minimum wage is now $10.40. I'm going to take a flyer here, but if you're in business, raise your hand if this has affected your labor costs. Not just because, not just if you employ minimum wage people, but because it raises the floor on everybody else. So this is due to keep increasing to $12.50. There's the table of increases by region. By 2020, this region, which has been economically very challenged, is being hit with a steady annual increase in the minimum wage. One way that affects costs that I wrote about a few years ago, childcare is labor intensive. You don't hire a robot for childcare. Childcare is the people, mostly women, who look after the children. It is the room with the toys that has to be kept clean, and it's the 3 or 4 or 5, usually women, who are working there, correct? Those women were typically making at or just above minimum wage. When you're talking about increasing their wages across the board by 20, 30, or 40%, there's a hard increase in child care costs of 20, 30, or 40%. That's what's happening. By the way, the governor did not acknowledge this when he had the bill passed, and it swept it under the rug for a few years. It's also going to add $1 billion in state Medicaid costs by 2 years from now, I think, because of what providers have to pay. So there's a ripple effect to all of this that's not sufficiently acknowledged, that's going to continue to add distress on an economy that needs to grow. Here's a little wrinkle for you to know about. This is a good news piece, but you need to be aware of it. There's a catch in the minimum wage law. This language that I put up here, let me translate it into plain language. This basically is an excuse for the governor, whoever the governor is, in January, to actually stop the minimum wage increase in its tracks, reconsider, and see what the impact has been. Regional business groups that are concerned about this minimum wage ought to be urging that this study go forward and producing evidence, if you have it, that it's having any negative impact. That's what this is an invitation to do. The governor basically has carte blanche authority to stop the minimum wage increase in any region of the state under this provision. So that is a potential speed bump if anybody is interested in exploiting it. It's in the law. Now, good news coming. First, the bad news. Workers' comp rates have consistently been among the top 3 or 4 or 5 states in the country. We have very high workers' comp rates. That's definitely cost of doing business challenge, especially in manufacturing. Good news, there were some reforms. I know Senator Akshar is here somewhere. There were reforms done largely at the Senate's behest with Assembly cooperation a few years ago as part of the budget. There's now been 2 consecutive decreases, including an 11% decrease in the base rate. It's going in the next latest base rates. It'll save businesses about $1 billion. Applied to this chart, state by state chart, it would move us. It would take away about half the difference of our excess over the national index. In this year on this chart, it would move us from 3rd place to 6th or 7th place. That is, it's a really important, real step forward. It's not the end. It's a good start. I'd also point out to you that $1 billion in savings, that's a good number. The state took $1.3 billion from the state insurance fund for its budget over the past few years, between 2013 and 2015. Just took it with no benefit to ratepayers. And it was not the first time the state had done that. It took $1 billion going back in the 80s and 90s also. So not using the state insurance fund as a piggy bank ever again would be a nice thing also. So this is, again, there's good news on this side of the ledger. This particular climate piece has gotten some improvement. More improvement is needed. I'm not going to get into prevailing wages, not enough time. Prevailing wage is a problem. It is a statewide policy that is, it doesn't just say, it is reported and talked about as if it's just making sure that we pay our construction workers decently. No, it ensures that you pay the highest building trades labor rates in the world in New York City projects, which affects the state budget. It effectively mandates that the contractual rules that apply to building trades unions in different regions of the state apply to the contract whether or not they're union workers or not. It's complicated, it's poorly administered, it's unequitable, and it's costly. And it needs to be reformed. We did a whole report on this, and it is one of the things that needlessly raises public works costs. This includes your transportation infrastructure as well as all other building costs. Raises the price of public construction by at least 12 or 13% in this region alone, probably more. There's also the so-called scaffold law. If you've heard of the scaffold law, it is a law that applies a unique level of absolute liability to employers of construction workers who are working at any height, even if it's a foot and a half off the ground. It's tremendously escalates the cost of property casualty insurance on construction work sites, and has added very substantially to construction costs around the state, upstate and down. Well, that also needs to be reformed. The principal obstacle to reform is the trial bar. The governor has been sort of in the background, kind of willing to do it, but not pushing it. The legislature has been fighting over it. Most of upstate representatives have sort of favored reform, downstate resisted. It's a really important reform. It also drives up construction costs. We need to stretch our dollars faster, and we're wasting them on issues like this. Final word, the clean energy policy is a real problem also. It's going to be a bigger problem going forward. We have this policy that is going to get billions of dollars in energy costs statewide. The oversimplification is in the name of encouraging renewable energy sources, we're basically going to require utilities to buy more and more from very high-priced, uneconomical, subsidized sources. It's ultimately going to bleed into rates upstate. Now, energy pricing is a mess statewide because we're also subsidizing money-losing nuclear plants in central New York and the Great Lakes region. But this makes it worse. In fact, the whole much-touted wind farm off of Long Island that is now being pushed by the state will, in fact, be paid for by ratepayers throughout the state, including here. Meanwhile, the grid, however, is an unrecognized problem. The capacity of the grid, both regionally and statewide, is a whole issue that has been largely ignored in pushing for this policy. One thing that also has happened, one historic transformation, is that the governor has taken almost sole control of energy policy. The legislature has allowed the governor to basically run roughshod over the energy area via his control of the PSC, which now functions, used to be very independent, although it consists of gubernatorial appointees, now basically functions as gubernatorial staff and does what it's told. This is a problem. There needs to be more engagement and understanding. I'm not going to get into, I haven't said it yet, the word yet. I haven't gotten into fracking. This is obviously very controversial. This area, ironically, given its economic stagnation, obviously is sitting on riches that it is choosing not to exploit. No matter how you feel about that, that's something that needs to be recognized. Compounding that issue is this region, more than any region of the state, practically, with exceptions, is starved for natural gas capacity and has been further starved by the state's policy of finding pretexts to disapprove any proposed natural gas pipeline extension. This is another aspect of energy policy that operates against the interests of the southern tier in general and the Binghamton area. If you favor that as a matter of energy policy, you have to live with the costs, which in the case of shutting down pipelines or denying them, means you've got trucks full of propane driving all over the place. So this is another problem. This is another policy that needs to change, about which very little is heard. Not sufficient, not enough is heard in Albany. And something, if it doesn't change, it's going to be harder to get out of this stagnant trend that you've been in. current energy rates, actually, in the Binghamton region and in the NYSEG region are among the lowest in the state, probably about the lowest in the state. It's not a matter of cost, but all of the policy trends at the state level are going to drive up costs. So you've got to be aware of that. That's a problem. One last thing, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Very few states have anything like seeker. You've heard of seeker. These are the states that have it are indicated on this map. It is the State Environmental Quality Review Act is not an environmental law. It does not protect the environment. It stays in effect because it has the word environment in it. All of the laws protecting the environment all of the state and federal laws protecting the environment are in other codes. The State Environmental Quality Review Act is a master planning statute, which actually discourages development or acts as another layer of bureaucracy and planning that can discourage development. That it actually can supersede local planning and zoning. And it does not supersede local planning and zoning in a way meant to streamline or to encourage development. It basically exists to give opponents of development another layer of process with which to slow down development. Now, we hear less about seeker in upstate New York because there's so little organic pressure for development in upstate New York that hardly anybody bothers complaining about seeker anymore. You hear about it more in the Hudson Valley, which will be growing much faster without seeker. But this is another deterrence that you need to be aware of that is almost not unique to New York, but is another unusual feature of New York law that suppresses development. One last thing now, and borrowing the phrase of the organization I know, they call themselves Unshackle Upstate. There's another issue is that as upstate grows poorer compared to the rest of the state, it also has a greater and greater need to get to free itself from the shackles of regulatory burden. The tax burden is actually driven and controlled increasingly by downstate elected officials and priorities. And it's interesting because there's been more ferment and more talk in intellectual circles, and even if you've been reading David Brooks's columns in the Times the last few weeks, left and right, about trying to encourage a renewed sense of localism, of subsidiarity, in which local communities and regions control more of their own fate. If there's any region that needs this, it's upstate. By the way, New York City is frustrated. New York City has just lost its stoplight traffic control cameras at schools because the state legislature didn't renew the law. Now, what business does the state legislature have deciding whether traffic control cameras are outside of schools in New York City? Well, New York City lacks sufficient control over itself as well. So New York City would like more control over its own laws. So would localities upstate. If localities upstate have more leeway to free themselves from some of the regulatory and tax policies I've been discussing, they'd have more freedom to change. There'd be more things that they could change as opposed to have the serenity to accept. So what are the three changeable policy priorities going forward that I would leave you with out of this? One would be you got to reform and reduce taxes. There's also the underlying priority here, which is don't let it get worse. Reform and reduce taxes. Control the drivers of local and state government costs. They are there. You're not going to turn on a dime and make New York State cheap overnight or less expensive. But something has to be done. More has to be done to control the factors that drive government costs. And clear impediments to growth. If you've got laws that make it harder to grow in an area that's shrinking, you need to clear those impediments out of the underbrush of regulation and statute. So this has been just an overview of some of the challenges that the region faces and the area faces. I've tried to put in a state context. There's a lot more that we can talk about, but I look forward to chatting with some of you after this, and thank you very much for your attention.
That's what I love about this is these are not just rhetorical talking points. He spends hours and hours and loves to dig into the meat of this so he can back up what he said. Now here, if you're at the table and you're a note taker, raise your hand so everybody can identify. All right. We are going to take the next 20 minutes. You have questions on your table. And I say elected officials, I also want to use the word representatives, because that is what we are and who you are. You represent each and every one of us in your position. So they're going to guide the questions on your table. This is just an open, honest dialogue. Talk about either, and we've addressed the overall arching challenges, so we don't have to hit that from the perspective, but share a few moments amongst your table. Our note taker is going to take the notes. And just talk about whether you can talk about your greatest opportunities and what you need to help make that happen for you as a business, or where you are in your position or your industry. You can talk about the challenges. You can talk about, you've got this moment, and you have someone here who works every day to represent you, to work harder for our community, to make the best place we can do. We're facing some challenges, but we have some great opportunities. And it's those of us, each and every one of us at the table, who are going to make those changes. So if you could just take a few minutes, open, honest dialogue. When we're going to compile it, it won't be published per se, what we do. Though what I hate is that we have dialogue and then nothing happens. So this is where we share that, we keep it in front of us. We look at in what are the common things that we need to work on. We saw that in the power of Senator Akshar leading the workers' comp. And when everybody came together with a single message, what we got accomplished. So this is about that on any level that affects you. So take the next few minutes, and then we're going to have a quick summary and close it out for the morning.
All right. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm the note taker. Nice to meet you.